The United Nations Assembly Hall had never felt so cramped. Hundreds of human diplomats sat shoulder to shoulder, their breath held collectively as the massive holographic displays showed the arriving Galactic Confederation fleet. 17 vessels, each larger than Earth's biggest cities, had taken position around the planet's orbit. Their presence wasn't hostile, technically, but the message was clear. Humanity's petition to join the Confederation would be decided today. Lieutenant Sarah Chen shifted uncomfortably in her plastic chair, tucked away in the back rows among other military observers. The sleeves of her dress uniform felt too stiff, the collar too tight. She wasn't meant for diplomatic meetings. Her place was in the field, where the rules were simpler: survive, protect, overcome. The alien diplomats filed into the chamber with practiced grace. Their forms varied wildly, some floating on anti-gravity platforms, others rolling on complex appendages, a few walking on legs that seemed almost human. But they all shared the same expression of thinly veiled disdain. High Ambassador Tilara, a tall, silvery being with flowing robes that seemed to defy gravity, took the central podium. Their voice resonated through the universal translators. We have reviewed humanity's petition for membership within the Galactic Confederation. We have studied your history, your achievements, your potential. They paused, multifaceted eyes scanning the chamber. And we find you wanting. Murmurs rippled through the human delegation. Sarah's fingers tightened on her armrests. Your species emerged from your planet's brutal conditions through violence and conflict. You lack the genetic refinement of civilized races. Your technology is primitive. Your society's fragmented. Your methods, crude. Tilara's translator couldn't quite capture the contempt in their native voice, but it came close. The war speaker, Kvex, stepped forward. Unlike the other delegates, they wore battle armor that seemed to ripple with barely contained energy. However, the ancient laws are clear. Any species, no matter how primitive, may prove their worth through the trial of combat. One champion, one battle, in the arena of judgment. Sarah's eyes narrowed. She'd read about this in the briefing packets, an almost mythical tradition where species too primitive for normal admission could earn their place through combat. It hadn't been invoked in over 10,000 years. Of course, Kvex continued, mandibles clicking with amusement. You would face our greatest warrior. Kithrix has never been defeated in 10 cycles of combat. The odds of a human surviving more than the opening moments are astronomically low. The human diplomats burst into heated discussion. Sarah watched as they argued among themselves, debating whether to accept this impossible challenge or retreat with what dignity remained. She saw the fear in their eyes, the resignation. They would decline. They would retreat. Humanity would remain isolated, vulnerable, seen as weak by the galaxy at large. Before she could second-guess herself, Sarah stood. Her chair scraped loudly against the floor, drawing all eyes to her. She removed her uniform jacket, revealing arms corded with muscle and crossed with scars, souvenirs from Earth's deadliest battlefields. I volunteer, she said, voice carrying in the sudden silence. The alien delegation erupted in laughter. Kvex raised all 4 hands for silence, their amusement evident. You? A female of your diminutive species. Sarah stepped into the central aisle, her boots echoing on the polished floor. I am Lieutenant Sarah Chen, Earth Defense Force. I accept your challenge. Lieutenant, stand down, her commanding officer hissed, but she ignored him. Kvex studied her with compound eyes. You understand this is not a simple contest. Death is not only possible but likely. Kithrix has ended the lives of champions from species far more advanced than yours. Sarah met their gaze steadily. I understand. I also understand that you've never faced a human before. The corner of her mouth twitched upward. That might be more significant than you realize. The war speaker's mandibles clicked rapidly, their species equivalent of a shrug. Very well. The trial is accepted. You have 3 planetary rotations to prepare. Try to make it interesting, at least. As the alien delegation filed out, Sarah caught glimpses of them, placing bets on her survival time. She smiled. They had no idea what they'd just started. The Confederation's pre-fight gala aboard their flagship made Sarah miss the simplicity of Earth's combat pits. Crystalline chandeliers floated without support, casting rainbow refractions across a gathering of the galaxy's elite. Alien diplomats and warriors moved through the crowd like living artwork, their bioengineered forms a stark contrast to her plain black dress uniform. The human actually showed up. A translator caught the whispered conversation nearby. How quaint. Did you see the statistics on their musculature? Barely better than a maintenance drone. Sarah sipped her water, ignoring the commentary. She positioned herself in a corner with clear sightlines to both exits and, more importantly, to Kithrix. The alien champion dominated the center of the room, their crystalline armor shifting colors like oil on water. 4 meters tall, with limbs that could bend in impossible directions, Kithrix moved with a precision that seemed almost mechanical. 50,000 credits says she doesn't last 30 seconds. A floating sphere of energy announced, its translator broadcasting at full volume. The betting had begun in earnest. Too generous, another alien countered. This one a towering insectoid. I saw the medical scans. Their bones are solid calcium. One hit from Kithrix's plasma-enhanced strikes will shatter them. A small crowd gathered around Sarah's corner, not bothering to hide their scrutiny. She recognized Lara among them, the High Ambassador's silvery form rippling with barely contained amusement. Tell me, human, Lara's translator carried artificial warmth. Are all your warriors so unmodified? Surely you have some genetic enhancements hidden beneath that fragile exterior. Sarah met their gaze steadily. Just natural human evolution. Ambassador, Earth isn't kind enough to need improvements. This drew laughs from the gathering crowd. A holographic display materialized in the center of the room, showing betting odds from across the Confederation. The predictions for her survival time grew shorter by the minute. Kithrix finally approached, their footsteps impossibly light for such a massive frame. The champion's armor plates shifted and realigned with each movement, a display of technology centuries beyond Earth's capabilities. Sarah studied their gait, noting the perfect, almost mathematical precision of each step. I hope you understand. Kithrix's translator spoke in perfectly modulated tones, that my victory must be absolute. The Confederation cannot risk encouraging other primitive species to waste our time with similar challenges. Sarah nodded. I understand completely. Quick question though. Does your armor's self-repair system work on crystalline microstructures, or just the macro damage? Kithrix's head tilted exactly 20 degrees, a gesture so precise it had to be programmed. An odd question from someone who can barely comprehend our basic technology. Just curious. Sarah shrugged, hiding her smile behind another sip of water. She'd spotted what she needed. The slight delay between Kithrix's visual processing and physical response. A delay no one would notice unless they'd spent years studying combat footage like she had. The betting displays suddenly chimed with new activity. Someone had placed an enormous sum on Sarah surviving past the first round. The crowd muttered in confusion until war speaker Kvext stepped forward, claiming responsibility for the bet. Not out of faith in your abilities, human, Kvext clarified. But Kithrix's victory will be more impressive with a longer demonstration. I've instructed them to extend your suffering for educational purposes. Sarah bowed slightly. That's very thoughtful of you. I'll try to make it worth your investment. As the aliens returned to their mockery and celebrations, Sarah made her way to the exit. She had more footage to study, more patterns to memorize. Let them laugh and bet and boast. Tomorrow, in the arena, nothing would matter except the fundamental truth they'd forgotten in their rush to evolve past their origins. Sometimes the most dangerous weapon was a mind shaped by survival rather than simulation. Kithrix watched her leave, their armor cycling through shades of confidence. They didn't notice that Sarah had spent the entire conversation studying the microscopic gaps between their armor plates, mapping out weaknesses no advanced species would think to defend against. Deep in the preparation chambers beneath the arena of judgment, Sarah pressed an ice pack against her bruised ribs, eyes fixed on the hovering display screens. The Earth Defense Force had managed to compile footage from Kethrix's last 17 matches, each ending in victory so perfect they seemed choreographed. "You should be resting." Dr. Maya Rodriguez, the team's medical officer, scolded as she applied a regenerative patch to Sarah's shoulder. Those practice drones did enough damage. Sarah shook her head, replaying a sequence where Kethrix demolished a cybernetically enhanced warrior from the Proxima colonies. "Look at this, Maya. Every movement, every strike. It's exactly the same as the match before it." "They're perfect techniques," Maya argued. "That's the point. The Confederation has spent millennia refining their combat forms into mathematically optimal sequences. No such thing as a perfect technique," Sarah muttered, thinking back to her first sensu's words. She gestured at another screen, freezing the image. "See how Kethrix responds to a low attack. The same counter every time. 37 degrees of rotation. Same force application, same follow-through." The preparation chamber's door hissed open. Captain James Wong, their tactical advisor, entered with fresh data crystals, more footage from the archives. "These go back 3 cycles, about 15 Earth years. You're not going to like what I found." The new displays flickered to life, showing Kethrix facing different opponents. Sarah leaned forward, ignoring the protest from her ribs. "They're all moving the same way. Not just Kethrix. Every Confederation champion. Standardized combat protocols," James confirmed. "They've turned fighting into a science, eliminating what they call primitive variability. Every warrior uploads the same combat database, executes the same responses." Sarah stood, pacing the room despite Maya's protests. The pieces were falling into place. They've evolved past their original fighting instincts. No improvisation, no adaptation. Just perfect, predictable patterns. "Perfect patterns that have killed 23 challengers," Maya reminded her. "Because those challengers tried to match the Confederation's style," Sarah replied. She pulled up her own practice footage from earlier, where she'd faced the training drones. "Look at how the drones struggled when I stopped using standard forms. They couldn't predict my movements." James studied the footage, understanding dawning in his eyes. The drones used simplified versions of Confederation combat protocols. When you fought unpredictably, their response time doubled. Sarah finished. They had to run new calculations for each unexpected movement. She gestured at Kethrix's matches again. "No one's ever tried to exploit that. They'd all fought exactly how the Confederation expected them to fight." Maya frowned. "Because that's how advanced species are supposed to fight. Precise. Controlled. Predictable," Sarah corrected. She stood in the center of the room, moving through a series of seemingly random steps. "Earth never gave us that luxury. We had to adapt to survive. Every culture developed different styles, different approaches. A boxer thinks differently than a wrestler. A street fighter moves differently than a martial artist. And you've trained in all of them," James realized. "You're not just a soldier. You're centuries of human combat evolution packed into one fighter." Sarah nodded, her mind racing through possibilities. "Kethrix's computer-perfect responses won't matter if they can't predict what I'm going to do next. Their advanced armor is useless if I attack where they think they don't need defense. It's still incredibly risky," Maya warned. "One direct hit from their plasma-enhanced strikes won't land if I don't move like their simulations expect me to move." Sarah turned back to the displays, studying Kethrix's flawless techniques with new eyes. They'd forgotten something important about combat, about survival itself. "What's that?" James asked. Sarah smiled, remembering every tough lesson, every scar earned, every fight survived on Earth's unforgiving battlefields. Chaos isn't a weakness to evolve past. It's a weapon, if you know how to use it. The arena of judgment stretched 200 meters in diameter, its energy shields humming with ancient power. Crystalline spires rose from the arena floor, creating a labyrinth of reflective surfaces and shifting shadows. Above, floating platforms carried thousands of alien spectators, their excited chatter becoming a deafening roar as Kithrix entered through the champion's gate. Sarah rolled her shoulders, feeling the weight of her simple black combat suit. The medical team had wanted to pump her full of enhancement drugs, legal under arena rules, but she'd refused. Speed and strength wouldn't win this fight. Everything depended on staying unpredictable. Final chance to withdraw. War Speaker Kvex's voice boomed through the arena. The Confederation will think no less of your species for choosing survival. Sarah's response was to walk forward, boots crunching on the crystalline ground. Kvix towered before her, their armor cycling through aggressive reds and golds. In person, the size difference was staggering. She barely reached their midsection. The arena's AI announced the start of combat. Kithrix moved with blinding speed, covering the distance between them in microseconds. Their first strike could have shattered concrete, aimed precisely at Sarah's center mass. She wasn't there. Sarah had dropped and rolled the instant the AI's first syllable registered, moving in a pattern no combat computer would predict. Kithrix's strike hit empty air, their perfect form carrying them forward as planned, because that's what their programming demanded. The alien audience murmured in confusion. This wasn't how fights began. There should be an exchange of formal techniques, a testing of defenses. Instead, Sarah was already inside Kithrix's guard, striking at joints and seams with short, brutal hits. Kithrix's armor absorbed the impacts easily, but that wasn't Sarah's goal. Each strike left microscopic stress patterns in the crystalline surface, patterns too small for the self-repair systems to register as damage. The champion responded with a sweeping counterattack, their limbs becoming a blur of motion. Sarah took a glancing hit to her shoulder, the impact sending her spinning. The audience cheered, expecting her to fall. Instead, she turned the spin into an awkward stumble that coincidentally carried her away from Kithrix's follow-up strike. Blood trickled from her split lip, but her eyes remained focused, calculating. "Stand and fight properly," Kithrix demanded, their voice carrying genuine confusion. "This is not how combat is conducted." Sarah's response was to grab a handful of crystalline sand from the arena floor and fling it at their optical sensors. The audience gasped at such a primitive tactic. Kithrix's armor auto-adjusted, clearing their vision in nanoseconds. But those nanoseconds were all Sarah needed to close distance again. The first round became a dance of controlled chaos. Kithrix's attacks grew increasingly powerful, increasingly precise, but they couldn't land a solid hit on an opponent who refused to follow any recognizable pattern. Sarah moved like a drunk one moment, a gymnast the next, mixing styles and techniques from Earth's countless combat traditions. When the round-ending tone sounded, Sarah was bleeding from several wounds. Her ribs screamed in protest, and her left arm hung awkwardly. The alien audience buzzed with disappointment. She'd survived, but surely she wouldn't last another round in such condition. Only a few observers noticed what Sarah had accomplished. In 3 minutes of seemingly random combat, she'd forced Kithrix to execute their full range of defensive protocols. She'd mapped every response, every programmed reaction. More importantly, she'd seeded their perfect armor with countless microscopic stress points, each individually harmless, but forming a web of structural weaknesses no diagnostic system would detect. As she walked to her rest station, Sarah caught Kithrix studying her with their head tilted at that precise 20-degree angle. She smiled through bloody lips, knowing the champion's combat computers were trying desperately to find a pattern in her movements, to predict her next strategy. Let them analyze. Let them calculate. They'd find nothing useful in her apparent desperation and chaos. That was the point. Survival wasn't about perfection. It was about adaptation. And humans had been adapting to impossible odds since they first looked up at the stars, and dreamed of reaching them. The second round began with Kithrix executing a perfect meridian combat form, their armor glowing with channeled energy. The champions' movements were a masterpiece of evolutionary refinement, each step calculated to maximize damage while minimizing exposure. Sarah responded by tripping over her own feet. The alien audience's laughter cut short as her stumble somehow placed her exactly where Kithrix's attack couldn't reach. She followed with a series of strikes that resembled no known combat style, a mix of drunken boxing, capoeira, and what looked suspiciously like dance moves from Earth's dubstep era. This is not combat. Kithrix's translator betrayed their frustration. These are the movements of an untrained juvenile. Sarah rolled under another devastating strike, leaving a streak of blood on the crystalline floor. Really? Because this untrained juvenile is still standing. She switched seamlessly into Wing Chun strikes, targeting the same microscopic stress points she created in round one. From the command platform, War Speaker Kivex leaned forward, their mandibles clicking rapidly. The human is making a mockery of sacred combat traditions. This cannot be allowed. High Ambassador T. Lara studied the battle with growing unease. There are no rules against unconventional techniques, but surely such primitive methods cannot. Their words cut off as Sarah executed what appeared to be a breakdancing move to avoid Kithrix's most powerful attack sequence. The champion's perfect form, backed by centuries of combat algorithms, hit nothing but air. Kithrix's combat protocols initiated their highest adaptation settings. Their armor shifted configurations, preparing for every known counterattack. But Sarah didn't counter. She started singing an old Earth bar song while weaving through their guard. "What is this?" Kithrix demanded, their strikes becoming increasingly aggressive. "Fight with honor." "Honor doesn't keep you alive," Sarah replied, her movements becoming even more erratic. "Earth taught us that. Every predator, every disaster, every war, survival means adapting, using whatever works." The alien audience watched in horror as their champion's perfect form began to deteriorate. Kithrix's attacks, still devastatingly powerful, became subtly less precise. Their combat computers were overloading, trying to calculate responses to moves that defied mathematical prediction. Sarah took hits that would have killed a lesser fighter, but each impact was glancing, reduced by her seemingly random movements. More importantly, each exchange forced Kithrix to strike exactly where she wanted, adding to the web of stress fractures spreading through their armor. "This is impossible," an alien weapons expert announced from the observation deck. "Her tactics violate every principle of advanced combat." A xenobiologist joined the discussion. "Look at her neuroscans. She's not following any pattern. Each movement is spontaneous, yet somehow purposeful. Because humans never evolved past their primitive survival instincts," T. Lara realized, their voice carrying a new note of respect. They merely learned to direct them. Below, the battle reached new levels of controlled chaos. Sarah mixed techniques from dozens of Earth cultures. Russian systema's fluid adaptability, Brazilian jiu-jitsu's leverage principles, Filipino Kali's constant motion. Each style flowed into the next without pattern or warning. Kithrix's combat protocols began showing critical errors. Their perfect responses became fractionally slower as their systems tried to compute counters to Sarah's unpredictability. Warnings flashed across their helmet display, reporting impossible calculations and invalid combat variables. "Your random flailing proves nothing," Kithrix declared, launching another devastating combination. Sarah turned the incoming strikes with Aikido principles, her bloody smile never wavering. "Random? No. Chaos isn't random. It's a force of nature. Earth taught us to work with it, not against it. Every hurricane, every earthquake, every predator hunting in the dark. They all taught us something you've forgotten." "And what is that?" Kithrix demanded, their frustration evident in increasingly uncontrolled attacks. Sarah switched to mongoose-style kung fu, targeting more stress points in their armor. That perfection is predictable. And predictable means vulnerable. As the round ended, the betting odds began to shift. The alien audience had stopped laughing. They watched with growing concern as their champion returned to their corner, their perfect form showing the first signs of doubt. Sarah wiped blood from her face, her smile widening. The real fight was about to begin. Sweat and blood dripped from Sarah's chin as she circled Kithrix in the arena's center. The third round had begun in silence, the alien audience too entranced by the unprecedented battle to make a sound. Her breaths came in controlled bursts, each movement measured despite their apparent randomness. Kithrix's armor had lost its pristine sheen. Microscopic fractures spread across its surface like spider webs, too fine for the repair systems to detect, but gradually weakening the entire structure. The champion's movements, once mathematical in their precision, had become sharper, more aggressive, driven by something their combat protocols weren't designed to handle. Frustration. "You cannot win this way," Kithrix announced, launching another devastating combination. "Your primitive tactics merely delay the inevitable." Sarah slipped past their guard using capoeira movements, then suddenly switched to Tai Chi principles, turning their own force against them. Winning isn't always about being stronger. She landed 3 precise strikes on previously weakened points. Sometimes it's about making your opponent beat themselves. The champion's next attack could have shattered steel, but it followed the exact pattern Sarah had observed in their earlier matches. She was already moving before Kithrix began, flowing around the strike like water around a rock. The alien's perfect form carried them forward, unable to adjust mid-sequence. From the command platform, War Speaker Kvex's mandibles clicked rapidly. Impossible. The human is anticipating attacks before they begin. Not anticipating, High Ambassador Tilera corrected, their silver form rippling with newfound understanding. She has identified the patterns in our combat protocols. Kithrix's perfection has become predictable. The weapons expert finished, their voice carrying both horror and admiration. Below, the battle's momentum had shifted definitively. Kithrix's attacks grew increasingly powerful, but less controlled. Each missed strike forced them to expend more energy, their armor's power systems working harder to maintain optimal performance. Sarah had stopped blocking entirely, conserving her strength while letting the champion's frustration work against them. "Fight properly," Kithrix demanded, their translator unable to fully capture their anger. "Stand and face me." Like this. Sarah planted her feet in a traditional karate stance. Kithrix immediately launched the prescribed counterattack, exactly as she planned. At the last possible moment, she switched to drunken boxing, turning their momentum into a devastating throw that sent the champion crashing into a crystalline spire. The impact should have been nothing to Kithrix's advanced armor. But Sarah had spent 3 rounds creating and connecting structural weaknesses. The crystalline plates didn't shatter. They simply failed to absorb the force as efficiently as they should have. For the first time in the match, Kithrix felt pain. The alien audience watched in stunned silence as their champion rose more slowly than before. Kithrix's combat computers frantically recalculated, trying to adapt to an opponent who followed no knowable pattern. Warning signals flashed across their helmet display. Stressed fractures connecting, power systems straining, combat protocols reaching their adaptation limits. "Understand now?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying clearly in the silence. "Humans don't just survive Earth's chaos. We learn from it. Every street fighter knows. Perfect form means nothing if you can't adapt. Every soldier learns. The plan only matters until the first shot fires. We've spent our entire history dealing with the unexpected." Kithrix charge, their attacks now driven more by desperation than programming. Sarah moved like smoke through their guard, each strike targeting another stress point in their weakening armor. The champion's perfect sequences began to falter, combat protocols struggling to compensate for damage they couldn't properly detect. The betting systems crashed as odds shifted violently. The alien weapons expert's voice carried over the growing murmur. The human hasn't been fighting to win. She's been systematically dismantling everything that makes Kethrix unbeatable. Sarah pressed her advantage, switching styles with fluid unpredictability. Each movement told the story of humanity's hard-won survival wisdom, each strike backed by lessons learned in Earth's harshest conditions. Kethrix, for the first time in their combat career, found themselves in an unfamiliar position, being hunted. The fourth round began with Kethrix's armor cycling through random color patterns, a clear sign their systems were failing to maintain optimal control. Sarah moved with deadly purpose now, her earlier chaos condensing into focused precision. She had written her strategy across the champion's armor in countless microscopic fractures, and it was time to collect. "Your combat rating has never exceeded Class 3, Kethrix said, their voice carrying genuine confusion. "Your biological enhancements are non-existent. Your technological integration is primitive. This should not be possible." Sarah slipped inside their guard, targeting a complex network of stress points along their left side. "That's your problem. You measure everything by your standards. But Earth doesn't create warriors in laboratories or download combat protocols into our brains." The champion launched a desperate counterattack, their movements still devastatingly powerful, but increasingly predictable. Sarah read the sequence from their subtle weight shifts, patterns she'd memorized through hours of studying combat footage. She wasn't just avoiding their attacks now. She was positioning them exactly where she wanted them. "Earth forges warriors through adversity," she continued, switching seamlessly between combat styles. "Every environment, every predator, every war, they all taught us something. Jungle fighters learning to sense movement in shadows, desert warriors reading intent in footsteps, street survivors turning urban chaos into advantage." A thunderous crack echoed through the arena as Sarah's strike connected with a key structural weakness. Kethrix's armor, designed to withstand plasma weapons and energy blades, began failing along precisely engineered stress lines. The champion's combat computers frantically attempted to compensate, but their perfect protocols had become a liability, unable to adapt quickly enough to their deteriorating capabilities. From the observation deck, the xenobiologist's voice carried clear amazement. "She's not just fighting Kethrix's armor, she's exploiting the limitations in their combat programming. Every unpredictable movement forces their systems to recalculate, consuming more power, generating more heat, creating more structural stress," the weapons expert finished. "It's brilliant in its primitiveness. No advanced warrior would ever consider such a strategy." Kethrix's attacks became increasingly desperate as their armor's integrity failed. They launched their most powerful combination, a sequence that had ended dozens of previous matches. But Sarah had seen it in her studies. More importantly, she planned for it. She moved like water through their guard, each step placed with surgical precision. Her strikes targeted junction points between damaged sections, exploiting weaknesses that even Kethrix's advanced diagnostics couldn't detect. The champion's perfect form began to crack, literally and figuratively. "Impossible!" Kethrix gasped as their armor's power distribution failed. "Our combat evolution is supposed to be perfect." Sarah's next strike shattered a critical connection point, causing cascade failures throughout their defensive systems. "Perfect isn't the same as strong. You evolved past your survival instincts. Humans, we kept ours and learned to think through them." The alien audience watched in stunned silence as their undefeated champion staggered. Kethrix's armor, the pinnacle of Confederation technology, was failing not from raw power, but from accumulated subtle damages. Their combat protocols, refined over centuries, had been turned against them by an opponent who refused to follow any predictable pattern. "This is why Earth's harshness is our strength," Sarah said, closing in for the final sequence. "We never had the luxury of perfection. We had to adapt, to innovate, to survive. Every human fighter carries that legacy, thousands of years of learning to turn chaos into advantage." Kethrix launched one last desperate attack, their movements now clumsy without proper power distribution. Sarah flowed around them like smoke, her strikes precise and devastating. The champion's armor, compromised by countless carefully planned stress fractures, finally began to shatter. The arena fell completely silent as Kithrix, the Confederation's greatest warrior, dropped to their knees. Their combat systems flickered and failed, leaving them vulnerable for the first time in their fighting career. They'd waited for the killing blow, the traditional end to such matches. Sarah's next move would shock the entire Confederation and change humanity's place in the galaxy forever. Kithrix knelt in the arena's center, their once perfect armor and shards around them, waiting for death. The ancient laws were clear. Defeat in the arena of judgment was traditionally final. The alien audience held their breath, expecting the human warrior to claim her right of victory through execution. Instead, Sarah Chen extended her hand. The gesture was so unexpected that Kithrix's combat protocols crashed completely, unable to compute this deviation from all known combat conclusions. Their head tilted, no longer at the precise 20-degree angle, but with genuine confusion. What is this?" Kithrix asked, their translator struggling to convey their bewilderment. "On Earth, we learn from defeat," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent arena. "The strongest warriors aren't the ones who never fall. They're the ones who get back up, who learn, who adapt. Taking your life wouldn't prove anything more than I've already proven." High Ambassador Tilura's silver form rippled with emotion. "This is unprecedented. No species has ever shown mercy in the arena of judgment. It goes against all combat traditions." "Perhaps," War Speaker Kvex responded, their mandibles clicking thoughtfully. "That is precisely why the human has won so completely." Kithrix stared at Sarah's offered hand for a long moment. Then, in a move that defied centuries of programming, they reached up and took it. Sarah helped the champion stand, supporting their weight as their damaged armor systems struggled to compensate. "I do not understand," Kithrix admitted. "You had the right to end me. Your victory would have been absolute." Sarah smiled through her blood-stained lips. "Victory isn't always about destruction. Sometimes it's about teaching. You called us primitive because we hadn't evolved past our survival instincts. But those instincts taught us something your perfect evolution forgot. True strength isn't about being unbeatable. It's about how you handle defeat." The arena's AI announced Sarah as the victor, its ancient protocols accepting this unprecedented conclusion. As medical teams rushed forward to tend to both fighters, the alien audience erupted not in cheers, but in profound discussion. They had witnessed not just a victory, but a fundamental challenge to their understanding of advancement. "The human speaks wisdom," Tilur announced, their voice carrying authority. "We judged Earth's harsh conditions as a mark of primitiveness. We saw their adaptability as a sign of evolutionary weakness. We were wrong." Kvex stepped forward, their warrior's perspective forever changed. "In our quest for perfect combat forms, we lost something vital. The ability to think beyond our programming, to adapt beyond our protocols. Humanity has proven that their path of evolution, while different from ours, is no less valid." Sarah stood straight despite her injuries, addressing the Confederation directly. "Earth's history is full of warfare, yes, but it's also full of warriors learning to become teachers, enemies learning to become allies, strength being measured not by destruction but by growth. That's the real lesson of human combat evolution." The arena's crystal spires hummed with power as ancient protocols activated. A holographic display materialized, showing humanity's petition for Confederation membership. This time, the acceptance indicators glowed green. "Lieutenant Sarah Chen," Tilera announced formally, "you have done more than prove humanity's worth. You have taught the Confederation a lesson we did not know we needed to learn. Your species is welcome not as primitives who have earned tolerance, but as equals who can help us remember what we have forgotten." Thrix, supported by medical units, turned to Sarah. "I would learn from you, if you are willing to teach. Perhaps there is value in imperfection." Sarah nodded, her smile genuine despite her exhaustion. "The first lesson is free. The galaxy's too big, too chaotic, for any single approach to be perfect. Real strength comes from learning from each other, from combining the wisdom of different paths. As she walked from the arena, human and alien medical teams working together to tend her wounds, Sarah thought about Earth. Every harsh environment, every struggle for survival, every lesson learned the hard way. They had all led to this moment. Humanity hadn't just earned its place among the stars. They had proven that sometimes the longest path to advancement is the one that remembers its origins. The last laugh, it turned out, wasn't about mockery at all. It was about joy. The joy of teaching, learning, and growing together.